yourselves. Welcome to the AI and Local News panel. We have an extraordinary group of people gathered, and I'm just going to tell you who they are and then ask each of them to tell us a little bit about themselves. So to my immediate right is Aimee Reinhart, who's the program manager for AI and Local News at the Associated Press. Then to my next right is Audrey Cooper, who's editor-in-chief at WNYC. Then Mark Hansen, who's a journalism professor at Columbia University, but you're other things. You have many other titles, which we'll talk about. And then last but not least, Claire Leibowitz, who's the head of AI and media integrity at the Partnership for AI. Welcome, everybody. We have an extraordinary conversation. And I wanted to start by asking each of you to tell us a little bit about yourself, just a minute or two, and one story about AI and how it's impacted either your career or your life, personal or business.
Great. Thank you for including AP in our work on the panel. I am part of, I've worked in journalism since 1992. I've seen the first wave of digital disruption when the web came. I was there for the second. It was kind of a tsunami because it was not just smartphones, but also social media. And I anticipate, I think all of us are probably here to talk about the third wave, which is artificial intelligence and how it's going to impact the newsroom. So I feel like when I've worked at other places throughout these years, that we keep missing the waves. And I think what this project is meant to do is really get this third wave in front of other people to say, look, we don't have to wait until it crashes on our shore. We can actually do something about it now.
Great. Audrey?
My name is Audrey Cooper. I'm the editor-in-chief of WNYC here in New York City. I've been here about a year, and prior to that, I was the editor-in-chief of the San Francisco Chronicle, so I'm a new New Yorker. And I came to WNYC. I've spent my entire career in local news because fundamentally, I believe that a lot of the problems we have in this country are due to a lack of investment, a lack of interest in local news, and that if we spent more of our time worrying about if our streets are paved and our children are educated and our air is clean, and less about the big cultural issue that are so polarizing, this country would be in a much better place. And I would say over my career, particularly being in San Francisco for so long, AI has come and gone in waves, depends on if the powers that be are interested in it in the time. We've had some good experiments, some not very good experiments. I'm sure we will get to those at some point.
Cool. Mark.
Hi, so my name is Mark Hansen. I'm the director of the Brown Institute for Media Innovation at Columbia University. And Brown houses within it a local news lab that's trying to build tools to create new forms of reader engagement and reader revenue. I'm also a professor. My doctorate's in statistics, and I teach computation to the journalism students at Columbia. To me, the interaction with AI, or more broadly with computation, is a moment for creativity. It challenges the way we do things currently, sometimes finding a better path, sometimes a more dangerous one, sometimes swapping old disparities for new ones, or maybe reinforcing the old with a scaffolding of mathematics. For reporters, specifically, computation and AI amasses new forms of power to interrogate, and it also offers new tools for that interrogation. For local news specifically, we get new data about towns and cities and counties. For journalism, the profession, it's new communication channels, new ways of reaching readers, new ways of finding and telling stories, new ways to spread those stories, and yes, new ways to get paid for all that work. But again, after the news this week about Facebook, not every new way is a good way. So computation and AI, to me, challenges us to think about what we're doing and what we could be doing.
Excellent. And Claire.
Thanks, Steve. I'm Claire Leibowitz. I lead the AI and Media Integrity program at the Partnership on AI, and I think providing a bit more context of PAI as an institution will actually preface how I think about AI and the future of local news. So PAI is a global multi-stakeholder nonprofit devoted to the very broad mandate of responsible AI development and deployment. And while we were founded by the heads of AI research at some of the largest technology companies, they recognize that some of the societal implications of AI, including how we have a healthy information ecosystem in the AI age warrants cross-sector collaboration with people from civil society, academia, industry, media, and journalism. So the program area I run, we convene over 100 stakeholders and produce research in order to move us towards best practices that get us towards this pro-social future in terms of the impact on digital media and online information. And I think there's a fundamental question of defining what that even means. And for us, infusing the local news narrative, which I think, as Audrey was describing, kind of it's the bedrock of how local communities make sense of an increasingly complicated world, is really important to that mandate. But something that we're really keen to do is understand the intersection between local newsrooms and how we can equip them with AI to be empowered and do a lot of the things that Mark just mentioned, while also understanding platform accountability. I think it's an interesting moment to discuss that, and the extent to which algorithmic recommendation AI tools are being used to distribute the content in a way that might affect the sustainability and the reach and many other metrics that implicate local newsrooms. So I'm really intrigued by kind of this cross-sector community that needs to be involved in thinking about the future of the technology and what's ostensibly a technical question and its impact on society and journalism.
Fantastic. All right, so I'm going to start with the title of this panel, and I thought we would just kind of pick it apart into its two critical parts and engage them one at a time, and then we'll kind of move forward. Let's start with this word local. So I think a lot, and when many years ago, when I first moved to New York, somebody said, your community is the 4-block radius of your apartment. And my wife and I make this joke because in reality, when we look at our actual behavior, it's more like 2 blocks. Like it's, yeah, 3, but 4 is a walk. So Audrey, you're in a unique position of the 5 of us. You run a newsroom, you run a local newsroom, you run a public radio newsroom, which means you get revenue in a different way than commercial. Talk about what does WNYC and what do you, under your leadership, what is local and how is it changing?
Well, there are a lot of things there. I mean, to me, local is what affects your day-to-day life or close to your day-to-day life. So, you know, what we've talked a lot about in our newsroom as we are, you know, redefining what we cover and how we cover it in order to be able to grow our newsroom over the next 3 years. We may get to actually double the size of our newsroom over the next 3 years, which is the opposite of what is happening in most local newsrooms, and certainly the opposite of what's happening in the broader journalism community in New York City. I talk a lot about making New York work for New Yorkers. And to me, that's utility journalism. It's helping people navigate issues. It's helping them provide context on issues that are before them, on local issues at the ballot box. And it's that day-to-day, like, what do I need to actually live my life better and more efficiently and more successfully? I mean, that's what, at the end of the day, what local means to me.
We'll come back to that doubling the size of the newsroom, because that may have been game set match for a lot of the people in our audience. So now let's look at AI. So one of the problems with talking about AI is that science fiction has created these characters, whether it be the Terminator or RoboCop, that are quite memorable and kind of laser beam etched in your brain. And I was trying to think of something mundane to talk about to describe what AI actually might be in real life. And at first I started with a toaster, and I decided, no, that wasn't right. And then I got to this piece of software that some of you may have seen or used called Grammarly, which some days does a really good job of saying, wait, you mean to say this, but it's really still rules-based. It's grammar, and sometimes when it follows grammatical rules, it can be quite off. Is there a better example of something that is in our daily lives, particularly in the news space today, that you would describe as AI, or are we not there yet? What about this software that writes stories for us? Is that AI?
Yeah, I mean, the AP has experimented, or more than experimented, it really pioneered in 2014. They were taking earnings from corporate earnings and then writing articles with that. And they went from reporting 300 earnings articles to 3,000. That was significant. That's a huge change. And at first, I think a lot of the reporters were like, hey, wait a minute, that's my job. But then they realized, oh, my job just got a whole lot more interesting. I can write analysis around those earning reports and not have to be kind of in the trenches digging around for that. So I think, is it perfect? Not always. It does a really good job, and it sounds human-ish, but there is that static quality of and all articles are tagged with "this was generated," and I think the Washington Post does the same thing to announce that this is generated by artificial intelligence.
I will say, oops, sorry.
And tagged to warn readers that it might not be accurate, or
no, it's a level of transparency, just like a byline. Like you would have a byline on an article. At the end of the article, you have what says, this was generated by whatever technology they're using, and I think that's an appropriate level of transparency. You have to have that, not to mitigate the risk of it being wrong, because there's corrections run all the time in every newsroom, every reliable newsroom. So it's just one of those things that needs to be included, I think.
The dialogue that goes along with that, though, too, is interesting, right? So the first set of automated techniques like this, I think narrative science, experimenting with them, were rules-based, right? So they would sit next to someone who writes and says, all right, how are you taking data and turning it into story? And then over time, I'm just going to continue to use narrative science as an example. Over time, they started looking at ways in which they might sort of start to introduce some kind of modeling. I would call it statistical modeling. For the purpose of this panel, we would call it AI, I suppose, that is trying to adapt. Oh, don't do that. That is trying to, that's discouraging. That is trying to adapt, thank you. That is trying to adapt the particular text to a context. So, for example, they started writing automated stories around, if I'm remembering correctly, around SAT scores. So someone gets a set of SAT scores, and then they can try to predict, if you study this hard for the whatever, you can up your score in these categories, but you should be studying here, here, and here. And there's a story that goes around with it. There's a narrative. And what they ended up with, and again, this is where sometimes I find these, following these AI or computational schemes to their limit, that what they ended up with is that they're now writing stories for an N of 1, right? They're writing a story that only you are supposed to read, which I think is an interesting sort of flip around the, or only something that makes sense to you because it's about your data and what have you. And so I think there's an interesting way in which, again, by following that computation and the kind of scaling that it does, you end up in a different place, and you can ask, do I want to be here? Is this a good idea? Is this a bad idea? How does this trade off with, journalistic labor usually?
Can I offer an unconventional example too that might be a little eerier than what's being described? So we think a lot about empowering local journalists who might not be people employed by an institution like the WNYC, but maybe people in other parts of the world who are users generating content to share with their communities or speak truth to power in maybe authoritarian context. So that may be another one definition of local news, but something we've seen in our work, we've dealt a lot with synthetic media, which is an AI use case where you can generate text or images or videos of people. So you may have heard of deep fakes, the idea that you could have a fake video of Claire Leibowitz ostensibly saying something that she never said. And these have actually been used in certain contexts. Our colleagues at Witness, which is a video and human rights organization, have seen AI's use to deep fake, oftentimes female journalists in certain parts of the world, to have a chilling effect on their work. So if you're going to create a pornographic deepfake using AI, for example, maybe that will stifle the production of really important local news in certain contexts where those voices are really important. So there's obviously AI's use in the news production, distribution, and even AI's use for targeting journalists, which I think is a potentially eerie use case for similar technologies that might be used for generative storytelling, may be used for generating videos or images of journalists in a way that stifles their contributions.
So I'm in charge of being the simpleton on this panel. So I'm going to ask kind of a black and white question, and then you can all tell me I'm wrong. Is AI as simply bucketed into two buckets? AI that replaces journalists and AI that enhances the work of journalists?
I can't even imagine an AI that would replace journalists. I mean, there's so much decision making, there's so much ethical consideration, there's so much, they have deep wells of contacts. That's not something AI can replicate. So I think that there is a fear, and I know that in the initial wave of AI that there was some job loss, but I also think to blame AI on that is incorrect. I think the program that AP is running for AI and local news, we are going to take a look at what could take away tedious tasks, what could really leverage the news operation out on the web and in social feeds. And those things I hope, will only shore up business models, will only really supercharge local journalists' work. So and it's not to say that AI is perfect and that there's no problem at all. Claire just, illustrated a terrible use case, but I think it's incumbent upon us to red team everything before we make it a suggestion for newsrooms to use.
Anyone want to push back on my two buckets?
No, I wouldn't. I like your two buckets, but I might push back a little bit on the idea that it hasn't been used and shouldn't be used to replace journalists, because I think AI alone, it's like any technology, you can use it for good or you can use it for evil. And, unfortunately, the majority of, maybe not a majority, but many local news outlets are owned by for-profit companies that are increasingly making less money than they used to, and they are looking for a way to cut costs. I don't know any of my colleagues in the editor-in-chief realm who aren't constantly having to look at ways to cut their newsrooms while they're getting pressure to increase the amount of content they are providing. And so I don't think it's AI to blame, but I think it often is used by the budget people as a way to augment something they are already cutting.
I guess let's go down this path for a minute, because we all work in AI in different ways, and we all find ourselves saying to journalists, no, this is going to give you the bandwidth you need to do more thoughtful work. But the reality is that the workaday journalist who's doing those financial reports and reading those stock ticker numbers and putting them into a fairly formulaic form may not be somebody. That job may go away, and maybe that money goes over to an investigative head, but that person still loses their job.
Well, and I would say that I personally, the Washington Post using high school sports scores to write short stories, like on the surface of it, that may seem perfectly fine. Your kid gets a write-up in the paper of, something or the website of their game that they wouldn't have otherwise covered. But I think we also have to remember what we lose in that too. Maybe it would have never existed in the first place, but if you get rid of all of your prep sports coverage that way, then you miss out on the next star, because you don't have somebody there watching the team. You don't have somebody actually covering something. You don't have somebody talking to the players to find out if their coach is a bad guy. There's a lot of things we still lose in the immediate response to cover just the game.
Let's talk for a second about this idea that there are actually new things. So for example, I know that there's been huge cuts in State House reporting across the country. And there's some interesting discussion about using AI to be able to take what are often fairly mundane, conversations and pull out of that information so that reporters get a filter to say, these are state news stories you're covering, and here's a hearing in which that material got pulled in, and here's the key paragraphs from it. I want to be optimistic and believe that AI is going to actually bring in a renewed coverage of particularly state governments. Is that wishful thinking?
Well,
Yes.
you know, speaking with Laura Frank at the Colorado CoLab in Colorado, she was saying that there are, in the southwest part of Colorado, there are 6 counties and 1 reporter. So that is too big of an area to cover. It's one of the biggest populations of non-white residents. There's a lot to cover there. And those reporting jobs are not coming back to that area. So in the absence of that, what do we have? Well, we have sometimes a patchwork of librarians who are telling you when the city hall meetings are going to be or when the community is going to gather. But is there something that AI could do in terms of covering that city hall meeting? And I use the word covering because, again, AI is not using discernment. AI can be programmed for some discernment, but there's always got to be that top level of editor on it. But for places where they just are woefully underserved by any kind of media at all, I think that, you know, AI could fill that gap and fill it nicely.
So I've never told this story, but in this panel, I think it's appropriate. So I ran the news department at my college radio station. And my first job out of college was as a reporter for WENU, We and You Together. They played Captain and Tennille back to back for hours at a time. It was adult contemporary radio. And my job was to drive to work at 3 o'clock in the morning and pick up the Bulldog edition of the Glens Falls Post-Star and cut it up with a pair of scissors and read it into the microphone. This was some time ago, before the noise about the collapse of media was, you know, as much a part of our conversation as it is now. After I was there about 4 weeks, my boss came to me and said, "Good news, we're making you news director." And my boss had been a woman named Dina, and I said, "Well, what's happening to Dina?" And he said, "Well, she's moving on." And I said, "Well, who's getting my job?" And he said, "Oh, no one, you're going to do both." It was the only job in my career that I quit. But, you know, this was a long time ago, and there was still this pressure to do more with less. And, you know, and I knew, having gotten a degree in English, that reading the newspaper into a microphone was probably called plagiarism. But out in the real world, nobody seemed to care, at least not in little upstate New York. Is the hand wringing about technology and its changes to journalism just part of a longer story? And is there always change? Which is why, by the way, starting with Audrey saying she's going to double the staff in her newsroom, like, we almost could have just wrapped it up right there and been like, okay, everything's good. All our students are going to have jobs. And I mean, and by the way, let's talk about that growth and how many of those people are going to be technologists or developers.
Well, actually, a lot of them will be. I mean, and when we were talking before, you asked me how many developers do we have, and I said, in the newsroom or in product. And to me, this is where we actually can use technology in a really great way in newsrooms. You know, when at the San Francisco Chronicle, we had an entire developer hub that just built things like tracking the wildfires, tracking air quality, tracking where you're most likely to have your car broken into. And I will tell you, that is the stickiest content that anyone can provide in a local news organization, because it's real utility for people and it's things that they want to know. It's engaging, and you don't need to write a 2,000-word article listing all the places you're likely to get your car broken into. You can tell it with technology. That skill set in journalism, we have more of them than we did 5 years ago, but they're still really hard to find, because you have to have that news judgment and a news sense, and you also have to be able to build the things. And many of us get into journalism because we don't want to do the math and go to computer class, so we like talking to people instead. So it's a new skill that, is hard to find. It's expensive. There's a lot of reporters out there, not very many developer data app tools people. So we are investing in that because I think it's really important work, and it's also really an exciting place, I think, and one that readers and listeners really appreciate too, that can also help build trust, which is another problem. This is a whole nother conference on that, but it's another problem, is like, are we even giving you the information, and how do you know it's right?
So, if I might add that, we've been at Columbia, we have a dual degree with computer science. So in 2 years, you get a degree in computer science, a master's in computer science, and a master's in journalism. We have a full 3-semester data journalism degree. And I personally teach a computational journalism class. And I have to say that the skill set that Audrey is describing, right, the capacity to talk to people, the capacity to, it's actually more than that, right? Because I come to Columbia from UCLA, where I taught statisticians, and statisticians always have a client in the background, somebody else asking the questions, right? So they're just, but you know, they don't have the same agency as a journalist does to look around the world and say, that doesn't seem right. I wonder if I can apply the skill set that I have to answer that question. Is that fair or not? Is this operating right or not? And so what we're creating with these dual programs, or even with my computational journalism class, we're helping students have that skill set, that capacity to look around the world, look at the world, and recognize where they can start to answer questions because that corner of the world is open to computation, right? And they're able to code, they're able to communicate in this way, so they can like poke at that. And then they can also follow it up the chain and start to talk to people and interview people and follow a story and build things up. So I think that there's a push toward, at journalism schools anyway, a push toward providing or helping students have those skills, recognizing that a responsible reporter now, no matter what beat it is going to have to deal with data and computation in some way, right? And they will have to use data and computation as part of their practice. And so how do we do it responsibly? How do we do it in ways that result in really rich stories?
So we're going to let the audience jump into some Q&A, but in a few minutes, but not yet. But Jerry Weinstein in the chat box has talked about fact checking, and I think that that's really a good place. Let's spend a little bit of time on two things that are roiling our collective industry: fact checking, and more importantly, misinformation. Does AI actually provide some clarity around how algorithms could label things as factual or not factual or in question, or does that really come down to human judgment?
So we've done some work with the platforms in technical methods for detecting misleading content, misinforming content, and oftentimes many of the cues that we have to algorithmically find what's misleading fall short is the main takeaway. Humans even debate what's misinforming content, which is, I think, a major thing that we shouldn't lose sight of. And oftentimes what's really tricky, and I think people need to remember, is there's a lot of truth in some of the most vile misinformation. So maybe there's a real image of us at this panel, and superimposed on that is like some misleading caption, right? That says 5 people in news gathering to talk about, I don't know, something malicious or vile that we're not talking about now. There's some truth to that, right? Because that image is a real image, but it becomes a very different thing when it has that caption. So how can a technical system actually detect that? That's really hard. So the interplay between the fact-checking community, technical systems as a triage technique, but by no means as a way to decide if something is true or not, is really important. And I think all these blurry edge cases are really hard for humans to make sense of, let alone for technical systems to make sense of. So in that regard, I have some empathy for the platforms in that regard. And I wouldn't want someone to take that comment out of context, but some empathy for them trying to, at the scale of the web, evaluate all content that's really semantically difficult to gauge. So I think the fact-checking community, which, you know, I think used to be more people would rely on news outlets themselves. Now there's third-party fact checkers as a way to make sense of content on platforms, but that's really tricky too, because they're all funded by some of the main platforms. So I think this gets into what is kind of the governance structure for arbitrating what's true or not, which technology can help, but that's only one piece of the puzzle.
Slightly off the AI topic, but just because it's relevant and it's something we're all thinking about and looking at, does this latest week and a half of kind of spiraling downward news about Facebook actually portend, you know, a change in that platform, or is it just the standard game? They'll, you know, I mean, someone jokingly said when Mark Zuckerberg had a bad day, he just pulled the plug for 12 hours and changed the story. Doesn't seem
the
impossible.
conspiracy theory. I will say so. I will say that Facebook has a lot to do. Even before this moment, they have been interrogating the reality, and I'll link it to local news, that optimizing for engagement on their platforms, giving people content that they want to click, does not help local newsrooms and get the good content, as we all, I think, viscerally understand it, in front of people. So they have been doing work to attempt to say, if we are not optimizing our AI systems for engagement, what should we optimize for? Should it be informativeness, accuracy, which we just said is really hard to gauge, like what is accurate and what is not? What does local news even mean if we're going to try and promote local news, to the first question in this panel, right? And I think that platforms have an appetite to have better classification of what good content is, so as to move away from engagement. That being said, I think there was a very elegant tactic taken in some of the documents that were released. They had to do with child safety, which I think is a much more bipartisan, agreed upon concept, that we all want to protect children more so than what constitutes misinformation and what doesn't, which is much more partisan. So I do think there might be some traction in the policy regulatory regime now, because of not necessarily that we're learning tons of new things, but that it's really anchored on a child safety use case, which people agree upon much more than misinforming content. So I do think this is a particularly interesting moment. I will say, and we were talking about this beforehand, this question of responsible recommender systems being the types of AI systems that choose what content you'll want to click, and how your feed is ranked, and what you see on Amazon and what you see on Facebook and why it gets shown to you, deciding what values those should be contributing to, and how to do that technically, is a really, really hard socio-technical question. So I'm happy we'll be talking about it. I also want to say, don't expect that overnight there's going to be some, your feed is just going to look like the most beautiful thing in the world. So some have said get rid of recommendation in and of itself and just have a chronological feed, which I think came up at the hearings yesterday, which is a really interesting suggestion.
I mean, it's worth just saying out loud that the idea of news organizations as profit centers for public companies is a relatively new phenomenon. Mm-hmm. I mean, in some ways, the idea that news was either a civic responsibility or a loss leader, but you made it for your television station or your local newspaper because it was good for the community, has, that shift is not, isn't very long behind us. And it's why, Audrey, it was circumstantial that you ended up in the middle box, but I think it's entirely appropriate, because, the idea of having a news organization that wakes up in the morning thinking about service and goes to bed at night thinking about service and gets paid by its listeners because they value that service is in some ways a much healthier relationship between a maker and a consumer than, this is an old truism now at Facebook, but you're not the customer at Facebook, you're the product. And what they're selling is you. And so I don't know how you get away from engagement as long as their profitability. I don't hear any big owners of Facebook stock in mass making the statement that people eventually made about tobacco, which is, I'm taking my money out of that because I don't like what it does to society. I think we're a fairly long way away from that. Although the tobacco analogy seems to be sticking a little bit, which is painful and effective. But Audrey, let's talk about public radio. I mean, it seems like it wasn't that long ago that it had a near-death experience, and the federal government was cutting funds, and it seemed like maybe the business model was going to fall off a cliff. Are people writing you checks? Are you getting people to come back and be a donor year after year? Not you personally, of course.
Well, I mean, the short answer is yes, and I think that's one of the reasons I left for-profit media to come to nonprofit media is it's actually a very stable business model for us, because we have a lot of small members that give us a relatively small amount of money, and that's a basis for longevity and success. When you rely on just a couple of people who write you really big checks and one year they don't, that's a very not so great place to be. So I think there's also a real affinity for public radio. People hear it, they know the personalities. So most studies show that public radio stations have a higher degree of trust in their markets. I think the challenge that I am obsessed with. And the reason, you know, the thing that gets me up in the morning, my husband makes fun of me that I think I'm going to save democracy by myself, but I kind of do, because I think we need to take all that trust and make it the newsrooms of record. Because as we've seen, you know, in New York City, the Wall Street Journal pulling out, the Daily News having its questionable ownership problems. Like, we are going to lose local journalism at scale if we don't take the nonprofit organizations that can do it and make them able to produce the amount of content that people actually want.
All right, we're going to open the Q&A box now. So here's how this works. You can ask a question, you can read other people's questions, and you can vote them up or down. And as we get questions that the audience wants us to answer, we'll throw them to the panel. And the answer is no, we're not telling you our PIN number or the name of our pets. So just ask reasonable questions and we'll try and answer.
I'll tell you the name of my pet. That's all right.
What's the name of your pet?
My dog's name is Tig. She's adorable.
Is she at work? Did she get to come to work?
Not today, no.
Yeah.
So just to echo Audrey's, the AP is also a member-supported not-for-profit, and that has changed what the AP is able to do. We were able, just like the Washington Post, the New York Times, and WNYC, to experiment. And what we were funded by the Knight Foundation to do for 2 years is to experiment with local news, because for them, they can't experiment. Experimenting means going under. If something fails, there's no recovery from that. So we are trying to build that capacity at the local level, so that we can say, hey, we've been there, we've done that. Here, you might not need this supercharged AI that we have, but you might need a slice of it, and we can help automate certain functions in the newsrooms with it.
So I should say, Audrey, you're the odd person out on this, because Aimee and Mark and Claire and I are working on this Knight Foundation 2-year grant. We all have different roles to play, and we're going to announce more specifics tomorrow when Matt McVeigh joins us at 10 a.m. to talk about that. So we won't get into that on this panel. All right, here's a question from the audience. More and more newsrooms are incorporating technology into news products. 2 things. 1, often I find the communication between reporters and editors and tech people isn't smooth, which is surprising considering that reporters are, in a sense, professional communicators. Do we need project management training for the newsroom? Reporters, by definition, swoop into contexts they're not familiar with, familiarize themselves with it, uncover hidden angles, and then explain it to the public. With some training, they'd be really good at tech communicating too, I feel. Do we need to teach reporters how to think about tech?
Oh, absolutely. And not just because, I mean, in part because tech, which is, I think we've just swapped for AI, but that's the heart of where a lot of news sort of product work is, right? There's a lot of innovation that can be had. But also because journalists are being asked to interrogate systems of power that are constructed from computing and AI and technology broadly. And so if they don't understand how it works, they're not going to be able to get in and really do good reporting. So I have a part of my computational class where the lecture is how the web works, right? And just because grow up, it's invisible. Technology just desperately wants to be invisible, right? Because it makes you feel modern that way. It makes you feel, whatever. And so you have to kind of interrogate what's going on. Like even the story of what happened to Facebook, right? I just following my Twitter feed, how many people were like, wait, what's DNS? What's going on here? And so reporters need to understand how new power is formed and is manipulated and is used in society. And that means understanding technology at a deep level. So it is part making new products and new forms of engagement and all of that, but it's also part just, this is how we do good journalism. Some fraction of us have to know how the world works to be able to say that it's not working right.
And AI crosses every beat at this point. you can't be, I'm City Hall reporter. I don't need to know AI. It's like city halls are using artificial intelligence technologies, to determine lots of things in municipalities. So you can't just sit back and say, that's not on my beat. It is a part of your beat. And like Mark said, I don't think you have to have a fluency in it, but you do have to know enough to ask the right questions. Because if you don't, like Mark said, if you don't know the tools power is using, you can't speak truth to power. So.
And if we go back to the city hall reporting, right? If there are PDF transcripts of what happened, right? We can a reporter who knows how to scrape content out of a PDF, who knows how to do some basic entity extraction. I'm not suggesting that these are that these are sort of super duper replacements for having someone sit there and watch a meeting, but being able to at least digest some of these documents as documents, so knowing a little bit of natural language processing or whatever is going to help get you pretty far. And again, I'm not trying to be some creepy positivist. I just think that there are possibilities for doing solid work that makes use of these tools, understanding what their limitations are, understanding why they find what they find and why they don't find what they don't find, and being very careful about that. And that requires proper technology training, which falls back into the academy in some way.
I think we're definitely changing your lower third to be Mark Hansen, creepy positivist.
Not creepy, but bang, creepy positivist. Can we put an exclamation in front of that?
Here's a great question from the audience. What are your thoughts on the Citizen app?
I've seen video from Citizen being incorporated into local news on local TV news here in New York. And to me, that was NBC. I couldn't believe that they used it. I don't know if it was properly vetted. I mean, I'm sure they felt confident enough that it was where they said it was, but I don't know if they have people vetting it properly to make sure that it's who took it, where it was taken, and that it's authentic.
Was it good tape, as they say?
It was tape. So I think like anything outside of the anchor speaking is probably preferred. But still, I was floored to see it, and we're going to see more of it. I think it absolutely ratchets up conjecture, misinformation, problems among neighbors. It's like, well, he always seemed a little strange. It's like, yeah, now he does, but you're not even sure if that was the right person. So it's just, it's a big problem, and Citizen itself has shown an appetite to be vigilantes when it comes to certain topics, like asking people to swarm areas with their phones.
And shockingly racist.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
Horribly racist. I mean, I had it on my phone.
I don't know why you'd modify that with shockingly, but yes.
Well,
Nextdoor too has that problem.
Expectedly, I would say.
Yeah.
I wanted to believe that it was going to be people. Well, I had a fantasy that it was actually going to be interesting, and then it turned out to be creepy. So, all right. Speaking of power, the gig worker, as opposed to full-time positions, what is, whether in academia as adjuncts or in journalists, also has a profound effect on the balance of power. How is unionization, or at least collective bargaining, part of that puzzle? I know gig workers who feel quite empowered by being gig workers. I don't know that I agree with that, but
I think the only way employees are ever going to feel like they're on a stable footing is by unionizing. I'm from a union family. My grandparents, my dad, I was part of a union when I was an adjunct professor. That's the only way to build in those guardrails that we just don't see. And I do think because of COVID, because of the social justice protests in the past year, people are just not having it anymore. And so they want that agreement, that buy-in, that support from a company. And I think it's absolutely reasonable. And I support everybody who wants to do that. I'm go Aimee, yeah. But yeah. I'm a union person, so I think it's great. I'm glad that the AP is a guild shop. I am not a guild position, but that's the only protection is collective bargaining, in my opinion.
So this is a good question, and I think it's probably for all of you. How do we bring AI innovation into small newsrooms that may not have the resources, either the technical staff or the bandwidth, to experiment and explore. And maybe the answer is the Knight Foundation project, but let's not pat ourselves on the back quite so quickly about that. I mean, isn't it for newsrooms in which everyone is maxed out, there's no extra bandwidth? How do you say, hey, try this new software? Like, how about never? Never would be good. How do we get AI into local news?
We're trying to take the approach of speaking to what is needed rather than like, hey, how about some AI? You know, because AI makes everybody's eyes glaze over because it doesn't speak to what the pain point is. Is the pain point events data entry? If so, we have automation that can help with that. And that could be a big win for a very small news operation. So we're trying to assess right now with a scorecard for as many US local newsrooms to take this scorecard as possible, so we know where the technology gaps are, and so we can maybe give and respond to tools that are needed and help newsrooms at a local level integrate that into their process.
We have time for just two more questions. Is it even productive to have hard walls between traditional reporters, editors, and tech people? There are stories about reporters with tech backgrounds being barred from traditional projects.
I just don't see, when I joined Columbia and heard the term data journalism, it just became clear after teaching a little and whatever that it's just journalism, that eventually these things are just journalism following its way through the way society is changing. And so I don't really think that, I will say that there's a flip to this. We've been talking about the impact that tech and tech training and data training and computational training might have on journalists. There is an interesting thing to be said about journalism training and what it might do to data science, right? So I'm supposed to be teaching a class in the spring where we're taking 10 PhDs in statistics and data science and pairing them with journalists and helping them understand what investigative skills look like, right? So that the technical people, the data scientists and the statisticians, have the capacity to start looking at the world in the same way that a journalist might, and suddenly bring with it, or into data science, a public mission that is something other than data for good, which is what you tend to get from academic organizations or data organizations. And that's not, data for good is not a public mission. People wax on about what journalists do and the role that they play in society to hold power to account and whatever. And some of the prose gets a little purple, but at the same time, I think that there's this profound feeling that journalists are there to hold, as I said, to hold power to account and so on. And I just don't think the kind of social mission of data science is there yet. And by crossing them with journalism, we might actually get somewhere. So,
I love that point so much. And I just want to say one thing about it is, like, I think that would also prevent companies from building crap we don't need, and that is not good for people. And building AI and building ways to scrape Yelp for the restaurant reviews and say which one's the best in town. Like, there are journalistic reasons why that is a terrible idea and it should never be built.
All right, so last question to wrap things up. Can each of you share either a product or a company or a piece of technology that you think is interesting, so that folks at home can scribble down on a notepad, go take a look at something? Because we've been talking in some, I think, fascinating conversation, but a little broad. I'd like to leave people with something you've seen that you think is interesting. And it's not an endorsement. It can be just curious. And I will start, and I will cheat a little bit. If you haven't spent any time with OpenAI and with GPT-3, I mean, the thing about technology is, over time, you know that it gets better, not incrementally, but in leaps. And GPT-3, and we're going to have the chairman and CTO of that company on at 3:15 this afternoon, is the first time I've seen AI actually do, in some cases, quite competent writing. Write me a paragraph about, Albert Einstein and why he was meaningful in science. Gets you a little Wikipedia-ish response, but certainly it doesn't feel like journalism necessarily, but it certainly feels like decent writing. And does anyone have another example of something people should look at, and then we're going to wrap things up?
I have wherever you're sitting, Google something that is civic minded. It could be like, where do I get my vaccine? Where do I sign up to vote? And see what you get in Google, see what you get in YouTube. And if you're working for a local newsroom, that can tell you a lot. You can say, we're not getting recognized by search engines. We need to do more evergreen reporting around these topics so that we are prioritized in search. But I think it's an activity you can do. I think it's very interesting. And those are the kind of things we're hoping to resolve when we work with local newsrooms on the AI and local project.
I'm going to step outside of AI and local news for a second and say that the environment that we're in right now, oh yay, is a fully programmable virtual sort of meeting space that is kind of awesome in a way that I didn't expect to think that something could be. It's made by some Snapchat engineers, and we've hosted lots and lots of events. Their connection to local news here is that the Brown Institute is sponsoring a project called Local Lives, which helps local journalistic organizations put on live events to help bring journalists closer to the community, so that maybe, by telling stories of how reporters do their work and so on, they might help build trust and sort of improve engagement in a way. And this kind of environment where you can script something and it doesn't look like Zoom and it doesn't feel like Zoom and it allows other sorts of things is really fantastic. And on the GPT front, my computational kids last semester, I gave them a task, use GPT-2 to write something. And the best project that one of the groups came up with was to take the Senate's UFO report and all the reporting around the UFO report and generate something new. And it was beautiful. It was this beautiful sci-fi-ish kind of thing that wasn't really grounded in reality, but also felt appropriate because, we're making stuff up. And anyway.
You guys have been fantastic, generous with your time, thoughtful and optimistic and honest, and huge round of applause.